It was a brisk morning in Flaxborough, the kind of day when the market town seemed to breathe quietly under a coat of mist, and the townsfolk, for all their activity, went about their affairs with the mild precision of a clockmaker polishing brass. The annual spring flower show had opened at the community hall, and the event, ordinarily predictable, now carried a subtle air of anticipation. Tulips, hyacinths, and begonias were arranged with an almost military discipline, yet it was the inconspicuous details, the tilt of a vase, the smudge of pollen on a label, that drew the sharp eyes of the local connoisseurs. Among them, Mrs. Higgins, a woman of formidable taste, and a habit of gossiping as if it were an Olympic sport, surveyed the exhibits with her customary frown. She muttered something about the scent of lilies being unseasonably overpowering, prompting Mr. Quince, the owner of the town's bakery, to nod gravely while juggling a cup of tea. At precisely 11:17, just as the judges bent over a row of particularly proud tulips, a disturbance rippled through the hall. The organist, rehearsing quietly for the charity concert later that afternoon, looked up to see Dr. Rupert Walden, Flaxborough's most fastidious general practitioner, standing beside the entrance in evident distress. His expression was calm yet peculiar, as if he had just realized that the very laws of nature had been momentarily suspended. I think there's been a theft," he announced in his clipped, careful manner. "A certain exhibit. It has vanished." A hush fell, followed by a crescendo of murmurs. The stolen item, it appeared, was a small, yet unusually valuable collection of rare orchids, the pride of Mrs. Higgins's horticultural achievements. The orchids had been arranged in an ornate glass case at the rear of the hall, and now, in their place, a single, crumpled sheet of brown wrapping paper lay on the floor. "What sort of person," muttered Mrs. Higgins, adjusting her hat with deliberate indignation, "would commit such a thing in full view of everyone? In my day we had manners even in mischief." Policemen had not yet arrived, though by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor it was evident that the local constabulary had been summoned. Meanwhile, the townspeople began to whisper in corners, offering tentative theories. Mrs. Weatherby suggested with no real evidence that the culprit was likely a stranger passing through, while young Timothy Brackett, whose father owned the tobacconist, speculated that perhaps the orchids had grown legs and walked off on their own. Inspector Purbright, who had received the call from the station via a muted, reluctant telephone, arrived quietly 20 minutes later. His presence was as unassuming as ever. He wore a tweed overcoat that suggested neither ostentation nor neglect, and carried a notebook that had seen many similar disruptions, though none quite like this one. He paused at the entrance, surveying the hall with patient detachment. "Good morning, Dr. Walden," he said politely. "You mentioned a theft?" "Yes, Inspector. The orchids. They're gone. I don't understand how it could have happened." Purbright nodded and allowed a moment of silence, as if absorbing the weight of the crime not merely on its own terms, but in the context of the town itself. He did not rush to ask questions, for the first interviews, he knew, often revealed more by what was left unsaid. Around him, Flaxborough continued its quiet agitation. The judges, having momentarily lost their balance between duty and curiosity, whispered to one another about the incident. Meanwhile, the townspeople speculated in increasingly elaborate fashions, unaware that the first hints of truth might already have been glimpsed by the observer, who noticed a single detail. The brown paper had an unusual crease, as if it had once been folded around something long and narrow. Inspector Purbright, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, made a note of the detail and of the expressions in the room. He did not yet speak of suspicion or motive, only of observation. In Flaxborough that was often the beginning, and, he well knew, sometimes the end, of any mystery. The commotion over the missing orchids had settled into a gentle murmur by the time Inspector Purbright took his first measured steps along the polished floorboards of the community hall. The crowd had thinned slightly, leaving behind clusters of residents who leaned in conspiratorially, their voices low but urgent, as though the walls themselves might overhear them and take offence. Mrs. Higgins, never one to allow a quiet moment, had stationed herself near the judge's table and was quietly berating anyone who glanced in the direction of the empty glass case. "In my day, we would have known immediately who was responsible," she murmured, her eyes darting toward a vague, unnamed figure at the corner. "People have no sense of propriety any longer." Dr. Walden hovered nearby, straightening the folds of his suit jacket and fingering the collar of his starched shirt. He seemed torn between irritation at the disruption and an internal calculation of social decorum. It was evident, even to Purbright's unhurried scrutiny, that the doctor considered the incident a matter of principle rather than mere theft. "It is utterly intolerable," he said, lowering his voice as if the very air might conspire with the orchids to escape again. "One does not expect, indeed one cannot imagine, a visitor taking liberties with one's botanical property in full view of society." Purbright inclined his head slightly. The doctor's phrasing, so deliberate and precise, offered as much information as it concealed. He made a mental note to observe the small fidgets and pauses, the tiny hesitations that spoke volumes more than any grand declaration. These, after all, were Flaxborough's currency, the silent signals beneath layers of etiquette. By mid-morning, the first wave of gossip had begun to circulate beyond the hall. At the local tea-room, the proprietress, Mrs. Pemberton, had gathered a small audience around the central table, all seated with the inevitability of those awaiting a verdict in absentia. "They say it's the new gardener from the vicarage," she whispered, her eyes wide with speculative excitement. "He has been seen loitering about after hours, and everyone knows he has a taste for odd flowers." A murmur of agreement, or perhaps curiosity, passed through the table. Meanwhile, at the opposite end of the town, Mr. Quince, still in possession of his morning tea, had already informed the baker's dozen of regular customers that the theft was likely an inside job. "No stranger would dare," he insisted, tapping his cup for emphasis. "And I happen to know for a fact that Dr. Walden's cat has taken a particular interest in orchids lately. One never knows with these animals. They have habits." His audience nodded solemnly, some suppressing smiles at the suggestion of feline involvement in a high-stakes crime. The pattern of commentary, Purbright noted silently, revealed as much about the town as it did about the incident itself. Each person's account served to illuminate their own preoccupations, fears, and tiny resentments. The theft, trivial as it might appear to an outsider, had activated an entire lattice of suspicion, rivalry, and self-interest. That lattice, he knew, would yield clues if approached with patience rather than force. By noon, Inspector Purbright had begun his preliminary inquiries, starting with Dr. Walden, whose demeanour had shifted from distress to mild indignation. The doctor led him to the scene of the crime, gesturing with precise fingers toward the display table. "The case was secured with a simple clasp," he explained. "I assure you, Inspector, no force was required. Whoever took the orchids did so with subtlety and, I might add, a certain audacity." Purbright crouched briefly, examining the remaining petals and the uneven crease in the discarded wrapping paper. "Curious," he murmured. "And the door to the hall?" "Unlocked," said Dr. Walden. "The key rests with the hall steward, of course, but anyone attending the show would have had access. It is a most inconvenient loophole." Purbright allowed a quiet pause, glancing over the hall once more. The patterns of foot traffic, the relative heights of display tables, the casual positioning of chairs. All were details invisible to the impatient eye, but significant to the one trained to see without pressing. He made another note, careful to record the crease in the paper and its orientation, along with the odd, faint scuff mark on the floor near the rear corner of the display. From there, he moved on to Mrs. Higgins, who regarded him with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. "Inspector, you must understand the severity of the situation," she said. "These orchids are not merely flowers, they are statements of taste, refinement, and the proper cultivation of society, and now they have been violated as though the world had no respect for distinction." Her hands fluttered as she spoke, betraying the slightest tremor beneath her practiced composure. "And did anyone seem particularly interested in your orchids before the show?" Purbright asked, keeping his voice unobtrusive, almost casual. Mrs. Higgins frowned. "Why, everyone, I suppose. But it is difficult to say. Interest does not imply guilt, Inspector, though one would hope that common decency guides behaviour in such matters." She paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "Though Mr. Bixby from the council has been unusually attentive of late, always asking after rarities, making the rounds, noting labels." Purbright made a note of Mr. Bixby, aware that local councillors often operated in a twilight zone between public duty and private curiosity. By the afternoon, a wider circle of inquiries had been conducted. Timothy Brackett, the tobacconist's son, had recounted seeing a figure, too tall for his liking, and dressed in a coat that appeared borrowed from a more metropolitan wardrobe, hover near the orchid display just after the judges completed their rounds. "I couldn't see the face," Timothy admitted, a little shamefaced. "But the coat had buttons that were shiny, like brass or something." Purbright did not react overtly, though he noted both the precision and the uncertainty in the boy's phrasing. Such observations, when combined with adult testimony, often revealed inconsistencies more telling than outright lies. By 4 o'clock the situation had calmed enough for Purbright to retire to a corner of the hall and allow his thoughts to settle. The patterns of movement, the subtle incongruities in the townspeople's accounts, and the single piece of paper on the floor were all fragments of a larger puzzle. As he contemplated the minor chaos, he could not help but reflect, as he often did, on Flaxborough itself, a town where civility was prized above all else, where the smallest deviation from propriety caused ripples of anxiety, and where crime, if it occurred, rarely shouted, preferring instead the quiet, almost invisible mode that challenged the mind more than the senses. He rose at last, brushing dust from his coat. There were other inquiries to make, more careful interviews to conduct, and the inevitable rounds of polite confrontation that in Flaxborough were the true instruments of justice. Yet for now he allowed himself a small satisfaction. The first layer of the town's secrets had begun to reveal itself. In the ordinary rituals of gossip, observation, and understatement, Purbright sensed the faint pulse of truth waiting to be drawn out with patience, tact, and, above all, civility. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled back into its habitual rhythm, though the theft of Mrs. Higgins's orchids lingered like a faint scent in the air, imperceptible to most, but insistent to those with the patience to notice. The town's newspapers had managed to mention the incident in passing, restrained as ever by a culture that preferred scandal to be discussed in whispers rather than headlines. A brief report in the Flaxborough Gazette read, "Rare orchids vanish from community hall. Town's horticultural pride disturbed." Beneath the headline, no hint of blame was attached, leaving the public to form its own conjectures. Inspector Purbright arrived at the hall shortly after 9, greeted by Mrs. Higgins, who had already begun reorganizing her remaining exhibits her movements meticulous and precise, as though the arrangement itself might restore order to the universe. "Inspector," she said with a stiff nod, "one hopes the matter will be resolved soon. I have requested that the hall remain closed to all but those strictly necessary for the investigation." Her voice carried a faint tremor, not entirely hidden by the veneer of composure, and Purbright noted it carefully. Anxiety, after all, often made itself known in small inconsistencies: an unsteady hand, a pause too long in speech, a subtle frown at an otherwise innocuous observation. Purbright began by retracing the steps of the previous day, examining not just the hall but also the surrounding corridors and stairwells. He observed the scuff marks near the rear exit, which appeared slightly too uniform for an accidental misstep. He crouched to inspect them closely, comparing the impressions with the soles of Dr. Walden's shoes, which he had politely requested the doctor leave for inspection at the station. The match was inconclusive, though the marks suggested a person of medium build, careful and deliberate in movement. After this preliminary scrutiny, he turned to the first of several interviews, beginning with Mr. Bixby of the Council. Bixby, a man of undeniable politeness and habitual watchfulness, received Purbright with a formal bow and an air of mild preemptive defence. "Inspector, I gather you wish to inquire regarding yesterday's unfortunate event," he said, smoothing the lapels of his coat. "I assure you, my interest in horticulture is purely theoretical. I am a man of letters and civic duty, not opportunistic tendencies." Purbright allowed a gentle pause before replying. "Mr. Bixby, I am aware that you inquired closely about Mrs. Higgins' exhibits during the morning rounds. Such interest, of course, is not unusual in Flaxborough. Still, would you care to recount your movements at the precise time the orchids were discovered missing?" Bixby's hand drifted toward his lapel, a minor gesture of self-soothing. "I was attending to other duties, Inspector, reviewing documentation for the upcoming council meeting. One cannot be everywhere at once, though I did glance past the rear of the hall merely to ensure the displays were in order. I confess I noted the exquisite orchids as any man of taste might, but—" His voice trailed politely, leaving the unsaid accusation hovering between them. Next, Purbright sought the account of young Timothy Brackett once more, this time away from the tea-room audience that had inevitably coloured the boy's narrative. Timothy, nervous yet eager to impress, repeated his sighting of the figure with the shiny buttons, adding a detail he had previously withheld. The coat bore a faint, irregular stain on the cuff, brownish, almost like dried tea. "I didn't mention it yesterday," Timothy admitted, "because it seemed unimportant. But now thinking on it—" His words tapered off under Purbright's calm scrutiny. "Not unimportant at all," Purbright said, his tone gentle, encouraging observation rather than judgment. "Detail are often the threads that connect what otherwise seems unrelated." Dr. Walden, meanwhile, had returned to his consulting rooms but remained accessible for questioning. When Purbright called upon him, the doctor's irritation at the disruption was tempered by a sense of civic duty, or perhaps the performative civility that Flaxborough demanded. "Inspector," he said, "it strikes me as odd that the thief would select only these orchids, leaving the remainder of the display untouched. Surely it implies a particular knowledge of value or taste?" Purbright nodded, taking careful notes. "Indeed. And might one consider, Doctor Walden, the possibility that such knowledge could be obtained without direct observation, conversation perhaps, casual remarks?" The doctor pursed his lips, considering the point. "Conversations, yes, though in Flaxborough one must be discreet. People rarely speak plainly about their prized specimens for fear of encouraging envy or impropriety." Throughout the morning, the inspector repeated a circuit of careful observation, polite questioning, and quiet reflection. At intervals he returned to the crease in the brown paper discarded near the display. The pattern of folds was deliberate, not careless, suggesting the item had been removed with attention to concealment. The paper itself carried a faint scent of bergamot, a detail that might have been overlooked by anyone else but which intrigued Purbright. By midday, a picture of potential motive and opportunity began to form, though nothing was conclusive. Mr. Bixby's mild anxiety, Timothy's observation of the stained cuff, and the careful precision of the removal all hinted at deliberate action by someone accustomed to subtlety rather than force. It was a stark contrast to the town's initial assumptions, which favoured clumsy outsiders or errant animals. Flaxborough, as Purbright had learned over many years, often hid its smallest crimes behind the most ordinary facades. The inspector allowed himself a brief walk through the marketplace, absorbing the rhythm of the town. Shopkeepers traded in courteous rivalry, children lingered on corners with polite mischief, and the occasional passer-by glanced curiously at his overcoat and understated air of authority. In this ordinary scene lay the extraordinary, the town's collective temperament, a web of observation and social expectation which would ultimately guide him to the truth. Returning to the hall in the late afternoon, Purbright convened a casual meeting with Dr. Walden, Mrs. Higgins, and Mr. Bixby, ostensibly to discuss the procedural aspects of securing the remaining displays. In truth, he intended to observe reactions, the subtle shifts in posture and tone that often betrayed the guilty. The conversation flowed with the utmost civility, punctuated by small, deliberate questions that invited more than they revealed. Mrs. Higgins fretted over the orientation of remaining orchids. Mr. Bixby's eyes flickered toward the discarded paper. Dr. Walden adjusted his tie with a nervous precision. None of these were admissions, nor did they need to be. In Flaxborough, the quiet revelation often preceded the dramatic one, and Purbright, patient as ever, was content to gather his threads while the town busied itself with conjecture and propriety. As the day waned and the hall emptied, the inspector lingered by the orchids that remained, contemplating the subtle signs the thief had left behind. Opportunity, knowledge, motive, each was evident but incomplete. Flaxborough, he reflected, demanded that one understand not just the crime itself, but the social mechanics that allowed it to occur. The town's rhythm, its etiquette, its web of minor resentments and whispered loyalties, all contributed to the eventual solution. He allowed himself a faint smile, inward and private, as he considered the next steps. The first suspect had begun to emerge from the ordinary folds of the town's life, though Purbright withheld all judgment. In Flaxborough, appearances were always deceptive, and only the patient accumulation of observation, politeness, and subtle probing could unravel the truth. Tomorrow would bring interviews with more peripheral characters, with attention to small grievances, minor habits, and the quiet tensions that, when combined, would illuminate the criminal hand. The town might consider the matter trivial, a minor disturbance to be murmured about in tea-rooms and on the market street, yet Purbright understood that in the ordinary lay the extraordinary. And as he left the hall, notebook carefully tucked under his arm, he was certain of one thing. The next move in the mystery would require nothing more than careful observation, quiet questions, and the unassuming patience for which Flaxborough's inspector had long been noted. By the following morning, Flaxborough had entered that peculiar rhythm of half-suspicion and full civility that marked the town whenever scandal brushed against its polished surfaces. Shops opened on time, the baker distributed his daily loaves with meticulous courtesy, and the market stalls hummed with the soft chatter of predictable commerce. Yet beneath the ordinary surface, the theft of Mrs. Higgins's orchids had set in motion a subtle nervousness that clung to the town like a thin fog. Gossip, as it so often did, had taken on a life of its own, transforming into embellished speculation, and by mid-morning it had reached the town hall, where council members exchanged guarded nods and thinly veiled judgments. Inspector Purbright arrived quietly, noting the careful way the steward of the community hall had repositioned the remaining exhibits. He allowed himself a moment to observe the town's atmosphere before commencing his inquiries. There was always something revealing in routine. The shift of weight, the glance toward a window, the occasional fidget of hands meant to conceal idle worry. Today, he would be following the subtle trail of human behavior rather than any overt evidence of criminality. He began at the town hall with Mr. Bixby, who appeared slightly more restless than the previous day. The councilman had spent the morning assuring his peers that he had no connection with the theft, a task at which he succeeded only partially. When Purbright entered the room, Bixby's smile was formal, but the crease in his brow betrayed the faintest trace of irritation. "Inspector," he said, rising and extending a hand, "I hope your inquiries proceed with the usual efficiency. Flaxborough cannot afford unnecessary alarm over trifles." "Trifles sometimes conceal more than they suggest," Purbright replied gently, noting the brief flicker of colour on Bixby's temples. "I am interested in routine and opportunity, Mr. Bixby, and any small detail you may have observed yesterday." The councilman shifted in his chair. "I did observe, of course, that the hall steward seemed unusually flustered when the incident was reported. It was peculiar, though I suppose such fluster is to be expected under the circumstances." His words were measured, yet Purbright caught the slight over-articulation, the way Bixby repeated an obvious observation in a way meant to convey distance from suspicion. Next, Purbright sought out Mrs. Weatherby, the woman who had immediately blamed a stranger passing through town. She welcomed him with an eager smile, keen to demonstrate her attentiveness to the event. "Inspector, I saw someone lingering near the orchids," she said, lowering her voice, "though I cannot be certain." He was tall, wore a dark coat, and carried himself as if he knew exactly what he was doing. But one cannot be sure, of course. Purbright nodded, noting the vagueness and the certainty intertwined in her speech. "Thank you, Mrs. Weatherby. Did you notice any small details, buttons, stains, perhaps a peculiar way of moving?" Her brow furrowed. "There may have been something on the cuff, though it is difficult to say. It did not seem significant at the time." Her voice carried the faint edge of surprise that comes when one recognizes the importance of a minor observation, even after the fact. With these accounts in mind, Purbright moved on to Mr. Quince, who had become something of an unofficial chronicler of the event at his bakery. Quince, flour dusting his coat, greeted the inspector warmly, eager to display his sense of civic duty. "Inspector, one must consider motive," he said, leaning forward. "Not all who admire beauty are harmless. I have seen tempers rise over lesser things. Envy, desire, the peculiar satisfaction of owning something rare. It is the town's currency, in a sense." Purbright allowed the remark to hang in the air, recording it in the margins of his notebook without comment. The interplay of civic pride, envy, and social propriety was always significant, especially in a community like Flaxborough, where appearances mattered as much as reality. The inspector then returned to the community hall, where the remaining orchids were arranged with meticulous care. He examined them carefully, noting the precise spacing of the stems, the absence of any fingerprints beyond those of the gardener, and the faint scent of bergamot still clinging to the brown paper. It was a subtle clue, one that might have been dismissed by an impatient investigator, but which Purbright catalogued mentally for later reflection. By afternoon, he had scheduled a series of interviews with those whose proximity to the incident offered both opportunity and insight. Miss Trevelyan, the town librarian, recounted observing Dr. Walden lingering near the display in an unusual fashion during the judging period, though she was careful to add that she did not wish to imply impropriety. "He seemed contemplative, Inspector," she said, as though calculating something beyond mere admiration for flowers. Dr. Walden himself, when contacted later, expressed polite consternation at the suggestion that his behavior might be misinterpreted. "Inspector, I assure you, my interest is purely horticultural," he said, smoothing his tie, "though one may understand how observation can be construed in a variety of ways." His calm, precise tone, however, did not entirely conceal the slight twitch of his left eye, a detail not lost on Purbright. The inspector allowed these observations to accumulate, understanding that Flaxborough's truths rarely revealed themselves through confrontation or insistence. Instead, he relied upon the quiet accumulation of subtle contradictions and hesitant gestures, like layers of sediment slowly revealing the shape beneath. It was in the pattern of these human behaviors, the understated lies, the minor hesitations, the polite avoidance of direct accusation, that the real story would eventually emerge. By late afternoon, Purbright had observed a minor but telling anomaly. The hall steward, ordinarily a model of composed efficiency, had begun to display small signs of nervousness when asked about the security of the hall's entrances. His eyes darted briefly to the floor, and his hands twisted together in a gesture of subtle discomfort. While nothing overt indicated guilt, the micro-reaction suggested either anxiety or knowledge not yet revealed, a thread worth following in the days ahead. As the town continued its routines, the inspector walked slowly back through the market, noting once more the way everyday life persisted despite the undercurrent of suspicion. Children played with exaggerated care, avoiding flower pots and displays as though aware that the social equilibrium was precarious. Shopkeepers offered polite greetings, their conversations layered with half-formed theories and hints of exaggeration. Flaxborough, Purbright reflected, was as much a puzzle of social patterns as it was of criminal acts. Returning to his office, he spread his notes across the desk, cataloguing each observation, each minor contradiction, each fleeting gesture. By the end of the day, a rough pattern was discernible: an individual with knowledge of horticulture, opportunity to access the hall, and the subtle audacity to remove a prized exhibit without alerting the crowd. Yet, as ever, the town's civility, its endless layering of politeness, secrecy, and pride, demanded patience. The solution, he knew, would emerge not through forceful interrogation, but through quiet accumulation of detail and the occasional well-timed question. As dusk settled over Flaxborough, Purbright allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The first suspect had taken shape in his mind, not through accusation but through observation of the rhythms, priorities, and tiny slips of those around him. Tomorrow he would pursue this lead with gentle probing, ensuring the suspect's actions, carefully watched, would reveal more than words alone could ever convey. In Flaxborough, appearances could never be trusted, but patience, civility, and the meticulous attention to human behavior could illuminate even the most delicate of truths. The morning air carried the soft promise of rain, a fine drizzle that lent Flaxborough a reflective, almost somnolent quality. The streets, though still occupied with the routines of commerce and schoolchildren, seemed subdued, as if the town itself were holding its breath in anticipation of some revelation. Inspector Purbright, his coat collar turned against the damp, moved with unhurried purpose toward the community hall. He had decided to examine the hall and its environs once more, following threads that had emerged during the previous day's inquiries. The hall steward greeted him with a faintly anxious smile, his posture unusually stiff. "Inspector, good morning," he said, adjusting the buttons of his uniform with careful precision. I trust your night was restful." Purbright nodded politely. "Satisfactory, thank you. I hope the night passed without any further disturbances." The steward shook his head. "None, though I confess, I have found myself reviewing the arrangements repeatedly. One cannot help but consider what might have been overlooked." His hands clutched the railing beside the doorway, a subtle gesture of unease. Purbright noted the tension without comment. Such small displays of anxiety often carried more significance than any verbal confession. Inside the hall, the orchids remained arranged with meticulous care. Purbright crouched beside the display, his eyes tracing the curve of each stem, the alignment of the petals, and the faint impression left in the carpet where the glass case had once rested. The brown paper lay folded beside the display, its crease still pronounced, the faint scent of bergamot lingering. He inhaled subtly, noting how the odor, so delicate, might have been deliberately employed to mask or mislead. Dr. Walden arrived shortly thereafter, entering with his customary air of restrained civility. He moved toward the display with careful steps, examining the orchids with the attentiveness of a man accustomed to perfection. "Inspector," he said, his voice polite but tinged with faint exasperation, "it strikes me as odd that no fingerprints were found beyond the gardener's. Surely anyone attempting removal would leave some trace, yet there is nothing. It is precise." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, noting the slight tension in the doctor's shoulders. "And the timing?" Was there a particular moment when the hall was less observed? Dr. Walden considered, tapping his chin with a gloved finger. "The judging took place mid-morning. I was occupied with the notes for the charity concert. Mrs. Higgins was attending to her other arrangements. The steward moved between tables. It is conceivable that someone with prior knowledge could have acted then." Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, observing the doctor closely. There was nothing overt in the man's posture to suggest culpability, yet the meticulous care with which he articulated possibilities indicated a mind trained to consider outcomes carefully. The subtleties mattered, the precise phrasing, the slight pause before emphasis, the choice of words, all contributed to the sketch of character that might eventually illuminate motive. By late morning, Purbright had begun a series of brief interviews with peripheral witnesses. Miss Trevelyan, the librarian, recounted seeing a figure near the hall's rear exit the previous day. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, yet she volunteered that the coat appeared to have been worn before, softened in texture, suggesting familiarity rather than display. "It was not new, Inspector," she said, "and the movements were deliberate, measured. One might not even notice unless one paid careful attention." Timothy Brackett offered further detail on the faint stain at the cuff of the dark coat. "I didn't think it was important," he said, twisting the hem of his jumper. "But I noticed it again today. In my mind, it's brownish like tea or something that's spilled." Purbright made a discreet note, combining it with the observations of the hall steward and the slight fluster displayed by Mr. Bixby. All these elements, individually minor, began to suggest a web of opportunity and knowledge overlapping in ways that the casual observer would never suspect. By midday, a small group of residents had gathered in the hall under the guise of curiosity, whispering conjectures. Mrs. Weatherby repeated her assertion that a tall stranger might have been involved, while Mr. Quince, flower flourished across his sleeves, suggested the possibility of local envy. Purbright allowed the conversation to unfold, observing each subtle contradiction, each hesitant gesture, each carefully calibrated exclamation. These were the building blocks of truth in Flaxborough, the ordinary behaviours of ordinary people revealing beneath the surface extraordinary patterns. In the early afternoon, the first real shift occurred. A note had arrived at the town's post office, addressed in a precise, unfamiliar hand. It was delivered to the community hall with polite urgency, and Purbright, upon inspection, noted its content, a request to view the orchids, ostensibly from a horticultural society from a neighbouring town. The tone was courteous, but carried a faintly insistent undertone. The handwriting was deliberate, careful, but with subtle variations that suggested an attempt to conceal certain habitual traits. Purbright considered the note, observing the reactions of those around him. Dr. Walden read it aloud, his voice calm yet revealing the slightest flicker of curiosity. Mrs. Higgins clutched the edge of the table, her composure taut. Even Mr. Bixby's mild frown deepened slightly, as though calculating implications beyond mere etiquette. It was in these reactions, more than in the words themselves, that the inspector saw the faintest outline of truth. A person with knowledge of the hall, access to the orchids, and an appreciation for social appearances might have orchestrated the theft with subtlety. Yet the note suggested either a desire for reconciliation, concealment, or perhaps a deliberate display of cleverness. By late afternoon, Purbright had completed further scrutiny of the hall. He noted a minor detail that had previously escaped attention, a faint indentation on the underside of one of the display tables, consistent with the shape of a narrow implement used to lift the glass case. It was a trivial observation, almost imperceptible, yet it implied premeditation and familiarity. The combination of this detail with the brown paper, the faint bergamot scent, and the observed social tensions provided a small but increasingly coherent mosaic of evidence. He left the hall quietly, allowing the afternoon to drift into evening. As he walked through the streets, he observed the ordinary cadence of life continuing despite the underlying tension. Shopkeepers exchanged greetings, children chased one another across the squares, and passers-by offered polite nods. Flaxborough's surface calm was deceptive. Beneath it, the town's network of observation, expectation, and etiquette continued to function, shaping and constraining behavior in ways that only a careful eye could detect. By the time Purbright returned to his office, he had assembled a subtle but promising map of opportunity, motive, and character. The first suspect had begun to emerge, not through overt evidence or confession, but through the quiet accumulation of behavioral clues, trivial details, and the interplay of civility and tension. He allowed himself a brief, inward smile. The town might consider the matter trivial, the theft a minor disruption, but for an inspector attuned to human subtleties, Flaxborough had revealed enough to make the next step clear. The coming days would require patience, careful observation, and perhaps a gentle test or two of the suspect's composure. And in that patience, Purbright knew, lay the certainty of eventual resolution. The morning light spilled gently across the cobbled streets of Flaxborough, a muted gold that highlighted the neat facades of the market stalls and shop fronts. Despite the lingering drizzle of the previous day, the town seemed to carry on with that same deliberate civility that so often masked 100 small anxieties. Inspector Purbright moved at his usual measured pace, notebook tucked under his arm, eyes scanning both people and place. Today, he intended to widen the circle of inquiry, to observe more subtle interactions, and perhaps to draw closer to the thread that would unravel the theft. He began with a visit to the florist opposite the hall. Mrs. Lomas, a woman whose knowledge of plant care was matched only by her fondness for town gossip, welcomed him warmly. "Inspector, it's all very peculiar, isn't it?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Orchids taken in full view, one would think a thief would have some sense of decorum, if nothing else." Her tone, half amusement, half indignation, carried the soft undercurrent of local competition. "And have you noticed anything unusual in your daily rounds?" Purbright asked, settling himself on the edge of a chair. Mrs. Lomas nodded. Well, there's been some curious interest in rare flowers lately. Mr. Cray, you know the man who runs the curiosity shop, has been asking questions about Mrs. Higgins' exhibits for weeks. Odd questions, too, how she keeps them watered, the light in the hall, even the exact type of soil. It made me a little uneasy, I must admit. Purbright made a careful note. Curiosity could be innocent, or it could mark the edge of something more deliberate. In Flaxborough, the distinction was often subtle and revealed in small gestures, a hand lingering on a counter, an eye flicking toward a display, a pause too long in polite conversation. Next, he visited Mr. Cray, a thin, angular man with spectacles that perpetually slid down the bridge of his nose. He greeted the inspector with a nervous, deliberate courtesy, as though measuring each movement. "Inspector," he said, voice precise, "I assure you my inquiries are purely scholarly. I am a collector of curiosities, yes, but I would never—" He paused, adjusting the spectacles. "Interfere with another's property." Purbright inclined his head politely. "I understand, Mr. Cray, and yet I am interested in what people observe. Even the most innocent curiosity can illuminate a pattern. Did you visit the community hall during the flower show?" "I walked past," Cray admitted. "I admired the displays. Surely that is permissible." His eyes flicked briefly toward the window, then back. There was a tension there, subtle, though he said nothing further. The inspector allowed the remark to hang, noting both the candour and the slight discomfort beneath it. In Flaxborough, small discrepancies often carried more weight than outright confession. By late morning, Purbright had moved on to interview Miss Trevelyan once more. The librarian, sitting behind her polished desk, recounted an additional observation. "Inspector, I noticed something else yesterday," she said, speaking with gentle hesitation. When the steward moved the tables for cleaning, a small tool, a sort of flat implement, was displaced beneath one of the supports. It looked as though it had been used recently, though I cannot say for what purpose. Purbright's attention sharpened. The minor oddity confirmed a suspicion he had formed but was not yet prepared to articulate. The combination of the brown paper, the faint scent, and now a tool displaced subtly beneath a table suggested premeditation. Whoever had taken the orchids knew the hall and its routine intimately. After lunch, he walked through the marketplace, observing not just the townspeople, but also their reactions to one another. Gossip, as always, moved faster than fact, and he allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of watching the network of observation unfold. Mrs. Pemberton, behind her tea-room counter, whispered to Mrs. Weatherby, who immediately cast an inquisitive glance toward a passing delivery boy. Mr. Quince leaned in close to a customer, sharing his latest conjecture, while Timothy Brackett skulked near the fountain, evidently rehearsing some version of events for any sympathetic ear. By mid-afternoon, the inspector returned to the hall, where a subtle commotion had begun to develop. Dr. Walden arrived unexpectedly, ostensibly to inspect the remaining orchids, but his manner suggested an additional agenda. He lingered near the display, hands folded, eyes scanning the floor. Mrs. Higgins noticed his presence and stiffened, though she did not speak. Purbright, observing the interplay, made a note. The doctor's composure, though outwardly polite, was punctuated with micro-movements, tilts of the head, flicks of the eyes, and brief hesitations that suggested careful calculation. It was at this moment that the steward approached, clearly flustered, carrying a small envelope. "Inspector, this arrived for you," he said, his voice tight with urgency. The note inside bore a familiar, delicate script, different from the previous message, and read simply, "The orchids are safer than you think. Look to the overlooked corners." Purbright considered the words quietly, noting the understated threat or hint beneath the civility. He allowed the note to linger in his mind, weighing both its content and its implications. The phrase "overlooked corners" could signify a location, a person, or even a subtle manipulation of attention. In Flaxborough, such indirect guidance was not uncommon. The careful use of words could mislead as easily as it could inform. He spent the remainder of the afternoon carefully examining the hall's peripheral spaces, the corners behind display tables, beneath window sills, the areas adjacent to radiator covers. In a small alcove, partly hidden by a folding screen, he discovered a faint impression on the carpet, barely discernible unless one knew precisely what to look for. The indentation suggested the placement of a small container, removed recently, consistent with the earlier observations of a tool and the brown paper. The inspector made meticulous notes, cataloguing each detail, without alerting the assembled townspeople to his discovery. He knew that in Flaxborough any overt display of evidence could provoke panic or false confessions. Patience, observation, and subtle inference were his instruments, and he wielded them with care. As evening approached, the town resumed its quiet rhythm. Shop shutters closed, lamps were lit, and the drizzle softened into a mist that gave the streets a polished sheen. Purbright allowed himself a moment to reflect. The first suspect was beginning to take shape, not through force or accusation, but through observation of micro-behaviors, contradictions, and subtle clues. The minor irregularities, the brown paper, the faint scent, the displaced implement, the overlooked alcove, were coalescing into a pattern. The next step, he knew, would require delicate testing. A polite, unassuming question or a casual remark designed to observe reaction. In Flaxborough, guilt often revealed itself not through confession, but through slight, involuntary responses, and the inspector was prepared to watch carefully, allowing the truth to emerge on its own schedule. He left the hall quietly, the streets glowing with the last light of day, confident that the next phase of his investigation would draw him closer to uncovering not just the culprit, but the subtle interplay of human behavior and social expectation that had made the theft possible. In Flaxborough, as always, the extraordinary lay hidden beneath the ordinary, waiting for those patient enough to see it. The next morning dawned overcast, the clouds stretching in a uniform grey that softened the edges of Flaxborough's rooftops and muted the town's usual chatter. Inspector Purbright arrived at the community hall with an unhurried step, his notebook under one arm, eyes quietly attentive to both people and place. Today he intended to begin the subtle test that would reveal more than words alone, an observation designed to elicit instinctive reaction rather than rational response. The hall was largely empty when he entered, save for Mrs. Higgins arranging a few remaining blooms and the hall steward meticulously dusting the ledges. Purbright allowed himself a brief inspection of the orchids, noting their position, the untouched brown paper, and the faint indentations in the carpet. These traces, minor yet deliberate, formed a sequence of human intent, a trail invisible to all but a patient observer. Dr. Walden arrived soon after, moving with the careful poise of a man accustomed to maintaining appearances. His eyes flicked briefly toward Purbright, and he inclined his head in polite acknowledgement. "Inspector," he said, voice measured. "I trust the morning finds you well." "Indeed, Doctor." "And yourself?" Purbright replied, observing the slight tension in the doctor's hands as he clasped them behind his back. As they conversed, Purbright allowed his attention to drift, taking note of micro-behaviors, the flicker of the eye, the tilt of a shoulder, the subtle shift in weight. Each movement, innocuous in isolation, became significant when considered alongside the earlier observations. The faint bergamot scent clinging to the brown paper, the minor stain at the cuff observed by Timothy Brackett, and the displacement of a small tool beneath the display table. Purbright decided to initiate his first polite test. "Doctor," he said, his voice casual, "I have been reviewing the observations from yesterday. It occurs to me that the thief, should they have had knowledge of the hall's routines, might have left some token or mark behind, something unnoticed at first glance." Dr. Walden's head tilted slightly, and a micro-expression, half curiosity, half apprehension, crossed his features. "A mark, Inspector? Do you suspect someone within the town?" His tone was even, but the slightest tightening around his eyes betrayed heightened attention. "Merely a hypothesis," Purbright replied, allowing the words to hang. "One considers all possibilities until the facts emerge." He continued to speak, deliberately veering into generalities, allowing Dr. Walden to respond, to reveal himself without overt pressure. As they spoke, Mrs. Higgins approached with a tray of tea, placing it on a small table nearby. Dr. Walden's hand briefly hovered over the cup before settling, a minor gesture, but Purbright noted it carefully. Subtle hesitation, especially over ordinary actions, could indicate an unsettled mind. Later that morning, Purbright observed Mr. Bixby arriving at the hall under the pretext of council business. His steps were measured, almost exaggeratedly cautious, and his glances swept the room before settling politely on each individual present. Purbright allowed the encounter to unfold without interference, cataloguing the interplay of politeness, observation, and slight nervousness. By midday, Timothy Brackett had been enlisted once again as an observer, discreetly stationed near the windowsill with a notepad. The boy's sharp eyes detected something new. A faint smear on the underside of the display case, invisible from above, as though someone had touched it briefly while lifting it. Timothy's description was careful, his attention to detail impressively accurate, and Purbright made a mental note of the significance. With these cumulative observations in hand, Purbright arranged a casual seating in the hall, inviting Dr. Walden and Mr. Bixby to join him. Conversation flowed with the utmost civility, punctuated by gentle inquiries and lightly veiled remarks. Purbright allowed himself to direct the discussion toward horticultural matters, the town's charitable events, and, most subtly, the topic of personal habits around displays and exhibitions. It was here, amid ordinary talk, that a faint but telling reaction occurred. Dr. Walden, while discussing the technical care of orchids, paused just slightly longer than necessary when the inspector mentioned the brown paper. His eyes flicked toward the small folded sheet on the table, and the slightest tightening of his jaw suggested conscious awareness. Purbright's mind catalogued the reaction without comment, understanding that observation often revealed more than interrogation ever could. Later in the afternoon, a minor commotion developed when Mrs. Weatherby entered, bringing news of an overheard conversation between Mr. Quince and a customer. The content was trivial, a discussion of rare flowers and the upcoming town horticultural exhibition, but the manner of speech carried subtle emphasis on certain plants, particularly Mrs. Higgins's orchids. Purbright noted the repetition and the pointed focus on her prized blooms. Social attention, after all, could act as both motive and mask. By mid-afternoon, the inspector had arranged a subtle test of his own devising. He invited Dr. Walden to assist in adjusting the position of a particularly delicate orchid. The task was ostensibly innocuous, yet the timing was precise. The movement occurred near the corner where the faint carpet indentation had been discovered. Dr. Walden's hands moved with careful deliberation, but Purbright observed a barely perceptible hesitation, a micro-pause that suggested recognition, or perhaps unease. The day drew on, and the town's ordinary rhythm continued outside. Children ran past the hall, shopkeepers exchanged greetings, and pedestrians paused briefly to inquire about the orchids. Within the hall, however, the subtle, orchestration of observation and polite engagement allowed Purbright to accumulate further evidence, behavioral and circumstantial, that would not have been apparent through traditional investigation. As evening approached, he took a quiet walk through the town, reflecting on the minor revelations of the day. The first suspect had been subjected to a polite but deliberate test, and while nothing overt had been revealed, micro-expressions, gestures and inconsistencies had begun to form a pattern. Flaxborough, as always, revealed its secrets in layers, each observation a piece of the mosaic that would eventually produce clarity. By the time he returned to his office, the inspector had assembled a detailed mental map of opportunity, motive, and subtle behavioral cues. Each small clue, the faint stain, the bergamot scent, the displaced implement, the overlooked alcove, the reactions to innocuous remarks, had begun to coalesce into a coherent whole. The next stage of the investigation, he knew, would require careful patience, the right question at the right moment, a conversation that seemed casual yet functioned as a probe. As the lamps in the office cast a warm glow over his notes, Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. The town may have considered the theft trivial, a minor disturbance in its orderly life, but the extraordinary lay beneath the ordinary, and for those patient enough to observe, to test without accusation, and to watch the interplay of human behavior with subtlety and restraint, the truth would emerge in its own time. Flaxborough awoke to a sharper chill than usual, the morning mist thick along the riverbank and curling around the spires of the old church. The town carried on with its routines, but a subtle unease had taken hold after the previous days of careful observation and muted gossip. News had already begun to circulate. A second minor but unusual incident had been reported at the community hall. It was not theft exactly, nor overt vandalism, but the discovery of several envelopes containing what appeared to be anonymous notes slipped into the spaces between display tables and under cushions where visitors often sat. The notes were polite, measured, and cryptic, each addressed in delicate handwriting, with suggestions or questions about the orchids. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 9, his coat damp from the lingering mist. He paused at the hall entrance, observing the town's subtle choreography, the steward fussing over chairs, Mrs. Higgins straightening displays with almost ritualistic care, and a scattering of curious onlookers peering through the glass doors. He had anticipated that the second incident would occur, a quiet escalation designed, perhaps, to unsettle those who had witnessed or participated in the initial theft. Inside, the hall was orderly but charged with a tension barely perceptible to the casual eye. The envelopes, uniform in size and weight, had been gathered into a neat pile on a side table. Purbright examined the first, noting its crisp edges, the precision of the handwriting, and the faint scent of bergamot, a detail that he realized with a quiet smile mirrored the faint aroma clinging to the brown paper from the initial theft. It was a deliberate echo, subtle but pointed, and the inspector catalogued it mentally, understanding that the perpetrator or orchestrator had a precise sense of theatricality, albeit restrained, and understated. Mrs. Higgins approached, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she gestured toward the notes. "Inspector," she said, voice measured but tight, "I do not know what to make of this. They are polite, yes, but their purpose is obscure. I do not know whether to fear them or merely to be vexed." Purbright nodded gently. "It is often the case, Mrs. Higgins, that what appears as vexation is in fact a means of communication. The sender seeks acknowledgement, perhaps even a reaction. We must observe both content and consequence." The steward, hovering nearby, interjected cautiously. "Inspector, do you think the same person responsible for the orchids is behind these notes?" His voice betrayed both curiosity and apprehension. Purbright allowed a moment's pause before replying. It is plausible, though not certain. The use of a faint scent, the selection of locations for placement, and the careful timing are consistent with the habits we have noted before. However, one must not presume too quickly. Observation must continue. He then invited Dr. Walden to examine the envelopes under the guise of consulting on their potential chemical composition, ostensibly to determine any preservation effects on the paper or ink. The doctor accepted with polite eagerness, moving carefully among the tables, hands gloved, eyes scanning both notes and surrounding space. Purbright observed closely, noting the slight twitch at the corner of the doctor's mouth when the bergamot scent was mentioned aloud, a gesture so brief it might have escaped an ordinary observer. By mid-morning, Mr. Bixby arrived, bearing the air of measured civility that often concealed faint anxiety. He lingered near the side table, commenting on the handwriting and its uniformity. "Such precision," he remarked, "suggests a mind accustomed to control, discipline. One wonders whether this is local or from some visitor attuned to the town's rhythms." Purbright allowed the remark to hang, noting both the words and the subtle shift in Mr. Bixby's stance, a slight crossing of the arms, a brief avoidance of eye contact. Observation, in these moments, was more revealing than any direct interrogation. Later, the inspector took a short walk through the hall, examining peripheral spaces and corners where the envelopes had been found. The impressions on the carpet, slight as they were, indicated placement rather than random tossing. The minor traces of pressure suggested deliberation, a calculated arrangement that mirrored the earlier theft's subtle signature. A narrow strip of floor beneath a radiator cover bore the faintest mark, consistent with a small implement used to slide the envelopes into place, a detail minor in isolation but significant when combined with the broader pattern. By early afternoon, Purbright convened a quiet, informal meeting with a selection of witnesses, Mrs. Higgins, the hall steward, and Timothy Brackett, who had proven particularly observant. He asked them to recount the timing of the envelope's discovery, the sequence of their placement, and any peculiar behaviors noticed in the hall over the previous days. Their accounts overlapped in some areas, diverged in others, and revealed subtle inconsistencies: a glance toward a side table, a hand lingering too long on a chair, a quiet shuffle behind a display. These minute details, catalogued carefully, formed a lattice of human behavior that could not be fabricated. The second incident, Purbright reflected, had altered the dynamics of the investigation. Whereas the first theft was a singular, isolated event, the envelopes introduced a pattern, an intentional communication, a psychological nudge designed to unsettle and manipulate perception. It suggested that the person involved had not only technical knowledge of the hall, but also an understanding of the town's social sensitivities and individual temperaments. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Walden had departed, citing an urgent consultation, though the manner of his departure was measured and precise. Purbright noted the timing, the route taken, and the subtle hesitation before he opened the hall door. These micro-observations, trivial in isolation, accumulated into a pattern that suggested heightened awareness and possibly self-consciousness regarding his presence in the hall. Later, the inspector spent time revisiting minor clues from the initial theft. The faint stain at the cuff, observed by Timothy Brackett, the displaced tool beneath the display table, and the indentation in the carpet that hinted at premeditated placement. With the envelopes now part of the narrative, these previously minor anomalies coalesced into a clearer sequence, demonstrating both intention and foresight. As dusk fell over Flaxborough, Purbright allowed himself a moment to reflect outside the hall. The second incident had achieved its purpose. It had shifted suspicion subtly, tested reactions, and created a layered tableau of human behavior for him to interpret. The town's rhythms remained outwardly undisturbed, yet beneath the polite surface, tension had increased. Residents speculated in hushed tones, children mimicked the careful movements of adults, and shopkeepers exchanged wary glances as they closed for the evening. Returning to his office, Purbright reviewed his notes meticulously, drawing connections among the minor details, micro-behaviors, and social interactions observed over the past week. The first suspects' reactions had been recorded, their subtle inconsistencies noted, and the introduction of the second incident offered additional leverage, a quiet, deliberate mechanism to reveal truth through response rather than confrontation. He leaned back in his chair, eyes resting on the window overlooking the dimly lit street. In Flaxborough, the extraordinary lay beneath the ordinary, and the day's events had brought him closer to understanding both the pattern of the theft and the character of the person behind it. The next stage, he realized, would require a carefully staged moment, a test of reaction, a polite but pointed observation designed to provoke instinct rather than thought. The threads were in place. It was now a matter of patient, deliberate weaving. The morning arrived over Flaxborough with the same muted light that had become characteristic of the town's early autumn. A damp chill clung to the streets, curling around lampposts and shop fronts, and the usual early traffic of deliveries and schoolchildren moved with a slightly hesitant rhythm, as if the town itself had absorbed the tension generated by the recent events at the community hall. Inspector Purbright, his coat buttoned carefully against the damp, settled at his office desk, allowing himself a moment of quiet reflection before confronting the day's tasks. He began by reviewing his meticulous notes, cross-referencing observations, minor anomalies, and behavioral details accumulated over the past week. The first theft, the brown paper, the faint bergamot scent, the displaced tool beneath the orchid display, the subtle carpet indentation. All these minor points had been catalogued with care. Now, with the second incident, the envelopes, he could see an emerging pattern that was both deliberate and psychologically informed. Whoever orchestrated these events understood human behavior intimately, exploiting civility, expectation, and subtle social pressure. Purbright leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and considered the town in its ordinary rhythm. Small-town life, with its emphasis on reputation, politeness, and subtle hierarchies, provided fertile ground for such manipulations. The seemingly trivial details of daily conduct, the careful avoidance of eye contact, a hand lingering slightly longer than necessary on a display, a micro-expression revealing discomfort, were the real language of truth. For an observer attuned to nuance, the ordinary offered far more insight than overt confession ever could. He reflected on Dr. Walden, the first suspect whose presence and conduct had already provided subtle indications, the slight hesitation when the bergamot scent was mentioned, the micro-pause while moving the orchid display, and the faint tightening around the eyes during conversation, all pointed to a man whose composure was carefully constructed, yet not flawless. Purbright knew that these minor fissures, though easily missed by the untrained eye, were the very clues that would ultimately reveal the truth. Equally important were the peripheral actors in the town, Mr. Bixby, with his precise politeness tinged by faint unease, Mrs. Higgins, whose pride in her orchids masked vulnerability to suggestion, Timothy Brackett, whose sharp eyes had caught the faintest indications of human activity, and the hall steward, whose meticulous attention to detail often betrayed unconscious concern. Each contributed to a network of observation and social nuance that, when carefully interpreted, revealed patterns of interaction and concealment. Purbright considered the second incident more deeply. The envelopes had not only reiterated the signature elements of the theft, the careful placement, the faint scent, but had introduced a psychological dimension, the deliberate communication. The sender sought reaction, subtly manipulating attention and emotion, prompting observation without confrontation. The effect was measured, controlled, and revealing. With these reflections in mind, Purbright began planning the next stage of his investigation. He would require a situation in which the suspect's instincts could reveal themselves. A question asked casually, a remark made in passing, a demonstration of behavior that could not be rehearsed. The goal was not to provoke confession, but to observe natural response under ordinary circumstances, a test subtle enough to go unnoticed by all but the keenest eye. He reviewed the hall layout, noting the alcoves, side tables, and peripheral spaces where the previous incidents had occurred. Each area had been examined, yet each offered possibilities for subtle observation. A slight shift in position, the movement of an object, the placement of a hand, any of these could trigger involuntary behavior, revealing knowledge or guilt. Purbright allowed his mind to trace potential sequences, constructing scenarios in which the suspect's reactions might betray more than words ever could. The inspector's attention turned briefly to the townspeople, considering their natural habits and vulnerabilities. Flaxborough's residents, polite to a fault, were conditioned to maintain appearances. A slight imbalance, an unanticipated question, an unusual placement of objects, a minor deviation from routine, could elicit a revealing response. Even those most practiced in social decorum were prone to micro-expressions, the tightening of the jaw, a flicker of the eye, the subtle hesitation in posture. Purbright also reflected on human motivation, pride, envy, social recognition, and the desire to manipulate perception. These ordinary impulses, when combined with opportunity and knowledge, could explain not only the theft of the orchids but the subsequent placement of the notes. The individual responsible was not merely acting out of malice or greed, but employing a nuanced understanding of social dynamics, creating a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to observe and unsettle without overt action. By mid-morning, the inspector had drafted a plan for a subtle test. He would arrange a demonstration of orchid care in the hall, ostensibly to illustrate techniques to Mrs. Higgins and a few trusted witnesses. The demonstration would include deliberate placement of a small object, a replica of the implement used during the theft near the alcove previously noted. Purbright anticipated that the suspect, if present, would respond instinctively, revealing knowledge of both the object and its intended use. The key was subtlety. Nothing should appear forced or accusatory. Later that morning, Purbright stepped out briefly to observe the town's reactions. Shopkeepers exchanged cautious greetings, children ran in playful arcs around the marketplace, and pedestrians moved with their usual deliberation, yet a faint undercurrent of curiosity persisted. The recent incidents had heightened awareness, and even minor deviations from routine were noted and whispered about. Purbright found satisfaction in this. The social environment itself had become a conduit for information, reinforcing the behavioral patterns he sought to observe. Returning to his office, he organized his notes, ensuring that each observation was carefully recorded. The brown paper, the bergamot scent, the faint stain at the cuff, the displaced implement, the indentation in the carpet, the envelopes and their cryptic messages, and the subtle reactions of those observed. Each detail contributed to a composite picture that, when tested, would either confirm his deductions or provide the faintest correction. As the afternoon light waned, Purbright allowed himself a moment of quiet contemplation. Flaxborough, with its polite facades and measured rhythms, had revealed far more than it realized. The extraordinary lay hidden beneath the ordinary, and the day's reflection had reinforced his conviction that the truth would emerge not through confrontation, but through careful observation, patience, and subtle provocation. He reviewed the plan once more, noting the timing, placement, and expected responses. The stage was nearly set. The next encounter would provide clarity, not by force, but by revealing the invisible threads that connected knowledge, motive, and behavior. And in Flaxborough, such threads were never conspicuous. Only the patient, attentive observer could discern their pattern. The morning arrived clear and cool, with a crispness that brought the outline of Flaxborough's rooftops into sharp relief against a pale blue sky. Inspector Purbright moved through the streets with his customary deliberation, noting the subtle reactions of townspeople, a shopkeeper lingering at the door, a postman pausing on the corner, and children casting cautious glances toward the community hall as they passed. The town carried on as though nothing had changed, yet beneath its polite rhythms a quiet tension persisted, an awareness of the recent disruptions that lingered in hushed conversation. Purbright arrived at the hall and allowed himself a moment to observe the exterior. The mist of the past days had lifted, revealing the neat cobbles and trimmed hedges, yet shadows remained, both literal and metaphorical. Today he intended to execute the subtle test he had planned, a demonstration that would appear innocuous, even instructive, yet would function as a probe, eliciting responses that could confirm or unsettle his developing suspicions. Inside, Mrs. Higgins was arranging the orchids with meticulous care, and the steward fussed over the placement of chairs as though anticipating a gathering of importance. Purbright made brief, polite observations of minor details, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the gentle sway of the curtains, the faint indentation along the carpet where a chair had been moved. Every element of the room's presentation was deliberate, and he took note, knowing the ordinary setting itself could function as a test, if manipulated subtly. Dr. Walden arrived mid-morning, his gait smooth and measured, the poise of someone accustomed to social attention. He greeted Purbright with careful courtesy. "Inspector," he said, "I trust you are well this morning." "As well as one can be with the town's curiosities keeping us alert," Purbright replied, voice even, noting the brief micro-expression of unease that flickered across the doctor's eyes. The remark was casual, yet it contained a deliberate reference to the recent incidents, an invitation for reaction without overt accusation. Purbright began the demonstration by introducing a small implement, a replica of the tool previously discovered beneath the orchid display. He handled it with care, positioning it near the alcove where the initial theft had occurred, and spoke of it in terms of horticultural technique. "These tools," he remarked lightly, "are often overlooked, yet they play an essential role in the proper maintenance of delicate blooms." Dr. Walden's hands hovered momentarily before moving to assist with an orchid, a micro-pause that Purbright noted with interest. His eyes flicked briefly toward the implement, and the slightest tightening of his jaw betrayed conscious awareness. The response was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet consistent with the pattern Purbright had been observing for days. As the demonstration continued, the inspector invited Mr. Bixby to examine a particularly delicate orchid. Bixby approached with careful politeness, fingers extended as though to touch the petals, but paused, glancing toward Dr. Walden, and then back to Purbright. The subtle triangulation of attention, the hesitation before contact, and the slight stiffening of posture provided additional behavioral data, reinforcing Purbright's developing theory. Mrs. Higgins, eager to demonstrate her own knowledge, moved a small tray of orchids closer to the table, inadvertently brushing against the alcove's edge. Purbright allowed the contact to occur naturally, observing Dr. Walden's reaction, a flicker of attention, a brief glance toward the displaced implement, and then a return to composed civility. The pattern was clear, though unspoken, recognition and perhaps calculation, yet carefully concealed beneath manners. By early afternoon, Purbright had orchestrated the final phase of his subtle test. He invited Timothy Brackett to place a series of envelopes, similar to those discovered previously, into the alcove while pretending to assist with flower care. The boy's movements were deliberate yet casual, and Purbright observed Dr. Walden's eyes follow each placement with attention almost imperceptible, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. The inspector allowed conversation to flow naturally, interspersed with gentle inquiries and remarks about horticultural technique. "It is remarkable," he said, "how even the smallest touch can affect the life of these orchids. Attention to detail is everything." His eyes flicked casually toward the alcove, toward the implement, and then back to the doctor. Dr. Walden responded with measured nods, yet Purbright noted the subtle tightening at the corners of his eyes and the micro-adjustment of posture that accompanied the innocuous statements. The final subtle test was completed when Purbright excused himself briefly, leaving Dr. Walden momentarily alone near the alcove. Observing from a distance, he watched as the doctor's hands hovered briefly, adjusting an envelope slightly, tilting the implement, and then stepping back with composure restored. Each minor action, when catalogued and analyzed in sequence, revealed an intimate familiarity with both the theft and the recent placement of notes, an unmistakable pattern of recognition and careful concealment. By late afternoon, the hall's ordinary rhythm resumed. Mrs. Higgins continued to tend to her orchids, the steward organized the chairs, and the envelopes remained in their designated alcove, seemingly untouched. Purbright allowed a quiet satisfaction to settle, knowing the subtle test had succeeded. Instinctive behavior had revealed knowledge previously concealed by manners and social grace. He gathered his notes, cataloguing each micro-reaction, pause and gesture, constructing a detailed narrative of observation and inference. The behavior observed, timing, attention, posture, micro-expressions, combined with the earlier clues of scent, tool placement and minor anomalies, formed a cohesive pattern. The identity of the individual behind the theft and subsequent manipulations was now evident, though still unspoken. As evening approached, Purbright left the hall, walking through the misted streets with a deliberate, unhurried pace. The town's outward calm persisted, yet beneath it the layers of tension, observation, and anticipation had shifted subtly. The extraordinary, he reflected, lay concealed beneath ordinary conduct, and those who were patient enough to observe carefully could discern truth without confrontation. Returning to his office, he reviewed his final notes before drafting the plan for the reveal. The moment would need to be calm, civil, and impeccably polite, a setting in which every clue could be connected, every reaction accounted for, and the truth exposed through logic rather than spectacle. In Flaxborough, subtlety was the greatest instrument of revelation, and Purbright intended to wield it with his usual precision. The morning sun filtered weakly through the windows of Flaxborough's community hall, casting pale light across the carefully arranged orchids and the small alcove that had become central to the week's events. The town seemed to hold its breath. The ordinary rhythms paused in quiet anticipation. Inspector Purbright arrived early, moving with his usual unhurried precision, eyes cataloguing details both large and minute, the tilt of a picture frame, the faint indentations in the carpet, the gentle sway of the curtains. Each element mattered, and each would contribute to the culmination of the investigation. Inside, Mrs. Higgins fussed over her blooms with extraordinary care, arranging petals and adjusting leaves in a display that now seemed almost ceremonial. She glanced up at Purbright, eyes bright with unspoken curiosity, and offered a polite, tentative smile. "Inspector, I trust today brings some clarity?" Purbright inclined his head, a faint smile of his own. "Perhaps, Mrs. Higgins. Let us see what the ordinary day may reveal when attended to with care." Dr. Walden entered shortly thereafter, composed as ever, though a subtle stiffness betrayed his anticipation. He greeted Purbright with a formal nod. "Good morning, Inspector," he said, voice measured. "I hope I am not late to whatever proceedings you have arranged." "Not at all," Purbright replied smoothly, letting the tone of civility dominate the moment while allowing room for observation. The stage, he knew, was set. What remained was the orchestration of quiet revelation. Purbright invited Mr. Bixby, the steward, and a few other local figures to observe a final demonstration of orchid maintenance. The gathering appeared ordinary, almost mundane, yet beneath the polite surface, the inspector had arranged circumstances to draw forth subtle responses. Every participant, willingly or not, was now part of a controlled observation, each action contributing to the narrative that would soon be disclosed. The demonstration proceeded with careful, deliberate steps. Purbright handled the implements as he had before, adjusted the orchids, and spoke of technique and care. His words were casual, almost conversational, yet every statement carried a gentle direction, drawing attention to specific details previously overlooked: the alcove, the envelopes, the slight stain along the carpet. Observers were unaware that each minor element was a test, a probe into human reaction rather than an explicit inquiry. Dr. Walden's behavior, as anticipated, revealed the final pieces of the puzzle. His glances lingered slightly longer than appropriate at the alcove, his hands moved with careful attention toward the replica implement, and his micro-expressions betrayed recognition of each placement and detail. These reactions, subtle yet unmistakable to the patient observer, confirmed knowledge and prior involvement. Purbright catalogued each movement quietly, a mental map of intent, recognition, and concealment forming in precise detail. With the demonstration complete, Purbright invited the participants to gather around a table for a final discussion, ostensibly about horticultural technique and town exhibition practices. Mrs. Higgins and the steward complied eagerly, while Dr. Walden and Mr. Bixby offered polite nods and measured attention. Purbright began to speak, his voice calm and unassuming, yet each sentence was deliberately chosen to link observed behavior with inference. "It is remarkable," he began, "how even the smallest details may conceal extraordinary intent. A flower, carefully placed, a note, slipped where none may expect, a tool, displaced with care. All are ordinary in isolation, yet when viewed together they form a narrative, one of observation, attention, and deliberate action." He paused, letting the words settle, then continued. "We have observed much this past week. Micro-movements, pauses, glances, and gestures that, though subtle, speak louder than any spoken confession. The envelopes, the brown paper, the faint bergamot scent, the careful placement of each object. Each is a chapter in the story that has unfolded quietly before our eyes." Dr. Walden's composure remained, yet Purbright noticed the faintest tightening around the eyes, a subtle hesitation that almost imperceptibly betrayed recognition. The inspector's tone remained polite, factual and civil, never accusatory, allowing the truth to emerge through observation rather than confrontation. "It seems," Purbright continued, "that one among us has engaged in these careful manipulations not out of malice or greed, but guided by a curiosity about human behavior, a desire to test observation, and perhaps a small, personal sense of amusement." He allowed the room to absorb the statement, watching reactions with careful attention. Dr. Walden inclined his head slightly, eyes fixed on a distant point, and Purbright observed a micro-expression of acceptance. "Yes, Inspector," he said softly, voice controlled, but lacking its earlier composure. "I suppose that is accurate. I did not intend harm, only to see if one could discern the ordinary from the orchestrated." Purbright nodded, as if noting a natural law rather than passing judgment. "Indeed, Doctor, and in Flaxborough, where civility and observation coexist, one learns quickly that subtle actions speak louder than the loudest declaration. Your curiosity, while carefully executed, has disrupted ordinary order, yet it has also provided insight into human attention, reaction, and perception. The remainder of the assembly listened quietly, the explanation delivered without melodrama, accusation, or spectacle. Purbright had connected every clue: the brown paper, the bergamot scent, the minor tool, the faint stain, the envelopes, the reactions observed during the subtle tests. Each element aligned with human behavior, revealing both motive and method without the need for forceful confrontation. Mrs. Higgins, once anxious, smiled with a mixture of relief and gentle amusement. "So it was all part of an experiment of sorts?" she asked, tone softening. "In a manner," Purbright replied, "though one must always consider the effect on others. Observation and curiosity are best tempered with awareness of the ordinary life we share." Dr. Walden nodded, accepting the guidance with the civility that had always defined him, albeit now tempered with acknowledgement of consequence. Mr. Bixby and the steward remained politely attentive, while Timothy Brackett, ever perceptive, scribbled notes with a faint grin at the subtle orchestration he had witnessed. By late afternoon, the hall returned to its usual rhythm. The orchids were rearranged, the alcove cleared, and the envelopes returned to their storage. Flaxborough resumed its ordinary life, the town's polite facades intact, yet beneath the surface, residents carried the quiet memory of events that had disturbed routine in the most understated manner. Conversation, observation, and minor speculation resumed as usual, and life continued without overt disruption. Purbright, seated once more at his office desk, catalogued final notes, documenting each micro-expression, gesture, and anomaly observed during the investigation. The ordinary had concealed the extraordinary, and the extraordinary had been revealed with subtlety, civility, and patient attention. Flaxborough, as always, returned to its rhythms, slightly wiser, yet outwardly unchanged. The inspector leaned back, eyes resting on the street outside, and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The truth had emerged without spectacle, judgment without drama, resolution without melodrama. All that remained now was the calm continuation of ordinary life, the subtle satisfaction of justice tempered with civility,